Hello, I'm Jerry Davis from the University of Michigan. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. This is for our AAAS panel on evidence from implementing strategies for aligning research with societal needs. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Caroline Paunov. She's a senior economist and head of secretariat for the OECD's Working Party on Innovation and Technology Policy. In her current position, she oversees the Working Party's work on digital and open innovation and on assessing the impacts of public research on innovation. Previously, she worked for the World Bank, the UN, and cooperated on various projects for the public sectors in Brazil, Spain, and Germany. So, Caroline, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me speak about a topic that is central importance to the work that I'm conducting, and I'll say a few words about why I think it's generally one of the fields that we need to pay much more attention to, and that is about knowledge co-creation. So what do I speak about when I talk about knowledge co-creation? So this is really about a process of the joint production of innovation that involves industry, research, and very often also other stakeholders, and in particular, civil society. This type of knowledge co-creation can take many different approaches. It can be of various nature. So there's a number of examples that I have included here of co-creation initiatives that show about that diversity. So there's an initiative that's called Brusseau, mentioned here, where it's really about involving civil society in building a much more sustainable development processes in a city context. But there's other initiatives that are much broader, such as the CATTC initiative of China, which is about really promoting knowledge transfer in a much more wider, in a broader region, etc. So it's really, we're talking about a very wide range of initiatives where what they have in common is really bringing together very different stakeholders from different institutions, and that have enormous inputs to bring in by working together on those innovations. And before I go and speak a bit about those examples and what we've learned from looking into them, into a number of those international cases, and understanding better what works about them and what's relevant, I want to give a bit of background as to where this work is coming from and why we're conducting it. And this is the work here that we do, and in this context of the OECD's work that is done with policymakers from more than 40 different countries who are participating in this exercise to learn about what they can do better in terms of promoting and supporting these initiatives, and what they should take into account when they design policies. So we have really, the countries, or the representatives around the table are from governmental institutions that are in charge of supporting, funding co-creation initiatives, as well as, of course, a range of other ways of supporting innovation. So what we're looking at is something that's very practice-based, and it's about like what exactly can be done. So what do we know about co-creation, and what can be done about that? And we've been looking into this for quite some time over the last years, and I'll be drawing on a number of cases that our member countries have been providing to us, and that we have been looking into to provide a number of examples, and that we will then put into practice in terms of offering not just materials and information, but really practical tool guidance along those. So let me move straight into the topic of what have we learned about some of those from those cases, such as the ones I've been referring to in the beginning. Well, of course, like important things to bear in mind, and why do we care? What are the driving factors of co-creation? The important part is that they bring when you manage to have a successful co-creation initiative, you really bring together complementary, multidisciplinary expertise. And this is becoming increasingly important for a number of different fields, for a number of innovations that really you cannot succeed in to the same extent if you just do it in your own little corner or in your own silo. And that's something important to bear in mind, because it is also one of the challenges then. How do you get all of this expertise to work together? Another part that is also becoming increasingly important as we speak about transitions and transformations and moving towards a different type of society is also engaging civil society much more and addressing some of the important societal challenges, whether this be specific challenges first faced in a locality in a specific context or global challenges. It is really in that context as well that co-creation becomes a very important mechanism. Number of challenges, however, will emerge. So not every good intention or not every co-creation initiative will succeed. And I would say actually very few will succeed from the beginning, because what you need to be achieving is that there's a good governance and a good operational structure, that you are all in agreement as to how you're going to deal with ownership and the use of the data and IP, and that you adapt to the different contexts, backgrounds, and motivations around the table. So that's like and that last point is a really important and pertinent one. Now, one of the experiments, and we have had to deal with in the co-creation scenarios, has to do with addressing the COVID-19 crisis. So there's been a lot of co-creation taking place by the sheer need to come up with a quick solution to so many challenges that were being faced. So this has been a moment where we have seen a proliferation of co-creation initiatives and cases of very different natures and different types. And what we've been doing since in this new phase of our project is to look into some of those cases and see what has made them operate, what have been their characteristics, what has made them succeed, or what have they struggled with. And you see here a number of them, so I'm not going to be able to talk in detail on any of those initiatives, just to say that what we looked into are both programs that try to support overall initiatives on co-creation, but also specific projects that aimed at building networks and building partnerships, building medical innovations, and also providing data-related solutions. So there's a number of them, like about a number of more than 14 countries, and some of them are also very international by nature. A few things, so we've looked into those in quite some detail, and there's a few things that come out of those experiences about what really is a successful factor in co-creation. So one thing is about regulatory frameworks. So something about simplified regulatory frameworks have in a number of cases been at the focus of these COVID-19 support programs, and they have been allowing quicker solutions and quicker efforts, quicker ways of coming up with solutions in the specific context. This included quicker ways of evaluating proposals, alternative ways of providing funding, sometimes in a more flexible or experimental ways, but also finding different ways of dealing with expenses and checking into or evaluating some of the progress in these programs. So something about regulation and regulatory frameworks has been an important factor that has helped some of these initiatives in a context where you needed very quick solutions. Another issue that has been interesting has been about networks. So we've seen in a lot of these initiatives that they benefited from existing networks. I mean, unsurprisingly, in a moment of challenge, you go to you go to those well-known contexts you can trust and you can operate with easily. And that has very often been the starting point. Although in some cases, we've also seen a different development, which has been an extremely interesting way of building networks from scratch. I put up here the EU versus virus challenge, which has been a very interesting alternative way of just putting up a hackathon and saying, well, what is it you can propose? And it was around the world, we've seen a number of initiatives. And what has been so interesting about them is that they have created entirely new networks. And sometimes it was quite surprising. So those organizing them to find themselves with applicants they had never heard about before, who had never approached them, to build and propose solutions. So there's clearly ways in which building on existing networks have helped. But we also learned through this crisis that co-creation can also be incentivized by facilitating new forms of building networks. Another factor that was absolutely important that sometimes, specifically when we come to some of those issues from a very, should I say, economics-based approach, is to not discount the fact that the motivation for participating in these initiatives is not a purely financial one, and in this case, it certainly wasn't. So there are a number of stakeholders that we found in those cases that have been contributing for free, that were not expecting any remuneration. They just wanted to provide and help with their expertise address the COVID-19 challenge. And so thinking about ways of considering how can you take into account other motivations than the simple personal reward, personal financial remuneration that might arise is probably was certainly an important way of making some of those initiatives operate, and is something to take into account. And, finally, the fourth point to put into account is the role of intermediaries. So it's co-creation. Of course, you can have very motivated individuals at different sides of institutions, but very often associations, alliances can play an important role in providing either space for the co-creation to happen or for facilitating contracts, facilitating interactions in a variety of ways. I think that's a fourth factor that we've also seen illustrated here. So it's not just about the motivation, you also giving a space for some of this is another important component when we come to promoting co-creation. Now, what does it all mean for policy, and where should policy go when it comes to promoting co-creation? In that regard, we have there's a number of factors that looked to think about. The first one is, of course, the why and how should policy being supported. And I think I've spoken to some of the arguments as to what is important here. There's a number of ways to take into consideration, including when it's thinking about when we talk about promoting and using co-creation to support and address some of the societal challenges that we are facing. There's a clear rationale for that we've been seeing. And here it's important to think about ways that are not just national, but that also take into account the international dimension, that take into account building networks, and that find useful ways of engaging civil society. That's been a component that we found has been very helpful when it came to applying some of the inventions that these co-creation initiatives have been created, and that still are not at the heart of a number of co-creation initiatives that could benefit from this type of involvement. But then once you've decided to provide a context to support co-creation, there's a number of other factors that will matter to promote them, such as allowing for mobility. So if an individual is tied into a specific position but cannot move from one institution to another, it is very hard for them to engage in co-creation. There's also design and managerial considerations that are important, and I'll not speak to all of those in details. But importantly is also to provide spaces for this co-creation to happen, whether this be a physical space or a virtual space is something depending on the type of contract of initiatives we're speaking about. But there's certainly a question here about these creating spaces and also having an independent agency or some kind of way of providing a space where these different stakeholders can meet on an equal footing, so to say, to understand and become true partners rather than because most of the challenges in the implementation can come from the perception of some of the partners that they're not being considered to the same extent as others, and so that they are asked to play a minor role, which can then lead to disengagement and problems then in the success of those initiatives. And finally, there's a range of issues about evaluating where you're going, where you're succeeding, and also then communicating what the initiative has been proposed, has been uncovering. So when it comes about your impact, you also want to take those into account. And I'll leave it at this for this short overview of that initiative.
No. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I've really learned a lot from this. Love to drill down on a couple of questions. So the first one is really you focused on some success stories in the case of COVID. And I know that during the pandemic, tens of thousands of papers came out in the social sciences, in medicine and elsewhere. And it was just this incredible sort of flourishing of research, which, ironically, but I wonder if in your experiences, if you learned something about the response to COVID that could be applied to take on other societal challenges. I was especially interested when you talked about the hackathon. Normally, hackathons bring people together in one space to work together, and that was much more difficult here. So what kind of lessons could we apply from what you saw with COVID to other kinds of societal challenges?
So one of the challenge that comes to mind is the challenge regarding building sustainability transition, environmental sustainability, because this is another major challenge that the global economy is facing. And where we could say, well, we would need a similar type of effort, a joint effort into doing research on those areas. And I think here there's a number of things we should try and apply from this COVID situation. The first one is to do with what I mentioned about this motivation and this mobilization of contributors who completely new contributors. So I would say this topic of sustainability, there's probably a number of populations who would be interested in contributing and who would be mobilized, whether this be people in cities who would maybe be interested and who would certainly be interested in finding like more sustainable mobility ways of moving around in the city and be engaged in some of the city planning around those things, to the hobby scientists who might have some free time in programming certain matters or contributing to some initiatives, and who might be willing to do so because they are actually concerned by this issue. Because back is like there's not just the financial returns and that gets people motivated. So I think leveraging some of those other motivations is useful, as well as when it comes to engaging civil society and others about using new mechanisms. So the hackathon is a good example. So if I can be engaged and contribute in virtual ways, then the barrier for doing the first step in the interaction is much lower than if I have to go and travel somewhere. And then, so I think there's ways of using some of the new mechanisms and not discounting civil society at large in these initiatives. And also the third one that was useful is that when with COVID, there was a joint target to be addressed globally, and you did have a global collaboration around like the COVID, especially the medical research on that matter. So defining a similar global target can also be interesting in other areas to really mobilize resources or the brains around the world, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I love your optimism. I too would love to see some knowledge co-creation around sustainability and the climate crisis. I wonder if you could share what are some specific steps that universities can take to try to support knowledge co-creation?
Mm. So when it comes to knowledge co-creation, one of the challenges in universities, unfortunately, that we've known has been happening for a long time, is to do with the incentive structures. So very often, when the incentive structures are geared towards mostly the publication process and maybe the teaching assignments that can be very heavy as well, then of course everything that becomes a societal engagement and co-creation becomes like a burden, becomes like a challenge that in the end, in many cases or in a number of cases, still is a luxury that researchers might be taking on, rather than and that can be a real a problem or a real challenge, really getting that societal engagement that otherwise I'm sure many researchers around the world would like to engage in more, because that's of course a very rewarding way of using your expertise, your research. But for me, an important part here is the incentive structures that still tend to be not to reward any of those alternative engagements or provide the right structures for doing so. The other part is, of course, also having like specific staff within universities that know and that have some expertise in engaging with industry, engaging with the external parts that are also useful and that can help, because as a researcher you cannot be knowledgeable of everything. So running a company plus your expertise plus other parts. I think also having that sharing of responsibilities is another important part. So I think there's more that universities can certainly do collectively with their governments in terms of getting more, turning more towards society than what is the case at present.
Have you seen any exemplary practices at universities? Like, so you're in economics, I imagine that QJE or AER are sort of prized places. Have you seen universities that say, all right, we're going to suspend our standard tenure practices, and if you publish something on epidemiology, that'll count? I don't know what that might look like, but you mentioned the incentive systems. Like, have you seen anything that you thought that was really encouraging?
I mean, what they've done is like in some cases, what they've done in the evaluations is to say, well, you can, in addition, unfortunately, it very often happens in addition, tell us about an example where you have made a difference to society, and that becomes part of the overall package that you're submitting. So it's not full way there, but you've seen there's some useful efforts in terms of where the research staff is at least invited to think about their societal impact and to write it down. Because I think it's already a first shift or a first change of perspectives. But I would say the important part is not to make it very, very often it still is something that is the luxury of researchers who've already made it, who can then say, now that I've made it, I can have the societal impact. And I think it would be really nicer to encourage that from the start, when you move into an academic career, you're like having a societal role. And so there's some good encouraging examples, but I wouldn't say it has become mainstreamed.
Yeah, I can say optimistically at my own school a few years ago, we added contributions to the SDGs as part of the faculty annual report. And so you can do both, ideally. Quick last question in our remaining less than 1 minute. You talked about including diverse viewpoints and that some people didn't always necessarily feel valued as stakeholders. What can a project team do to sort of organize their decision-making process to ensure that they get the benefit of all these diverse viewpoints?
Yeah, so that is a major challenge that it would be hard to address in the 80 seconds that are left for this call. But it's about really giving the floor to all and making sure that strong stakeholders are not not outperforming some of the smaller ones, and really giving them the opportunity.
Okay, so it sounds like it is possible. So we will revisit that in our next year's panel, I suppose. Thank you so much, Dr. Caroline Paunov from the OECD. I've learned a lot from this session, and I encourage everyone who's viewing this to watch the other two sessions that are part of this panel and join us in February at the AAAS meeting. Thanks very much.